All right. Well, we've been spending the last few weeks looking at the Israelites and the Exodus from Egypt and everything surrounding that. Last week we looked at their time in the wilderness after the Exodus and how their faith in God and in Moses is kind of up and down. It's fluctuating. One minute they're praising God for providing for him, and the next minute they're cursing Moses and they're wishing they were back in Egypt. They let their circumstances dictate their faith, right? And so it's a faith that wavers. They were very much like what the book of James describes, that man who doubts and is tossed to and fro by the wind, by the waves and the wind. Sometimes when we read the story, it's only a matter of days between them praising God and then falling into despair, into hopelessness, and again, wishing they were back in Egypt. And they're so up and down that it's almost laughable as we're reading it, and it just kind of makes us shake our heads as we read through their story. This morning I want to focus one last time on the man who's leading these people, Moses. How does Moses react to the wavering faith of the Israelites? We shake our heads when we read this story, but Moses was there, and he was in charge. He was called by God to lead these people. So how does Moses feel about these ups and downs that they have? How does he deal with it? How does he fulfill God's call to lead this group of people, this group of stubborn and rebellious people? Because we know that he perseveres. He perseveres to the end. He takes them to the promised land. And 40 years later, he dies leading them there. He fulfills what God had called him to do. So I want to start off this morning by looking at an interesting but slightly confusing passage in Hebrews 11. Hopefully we can get through the confusion, because I think it's going to help us understand some of these questions we have about Moses and how he perseveres. And so in Hebrews 11:24, it says, "By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin." Before the Exodus, before even before the exile to Midian, when he runs away to Midian, Moses was in Pharaoh's palace. And we went through this a couple of weeks ago. Moses spends the first 40 years of his life in the palace in Egypt. And although he's raised as an Egyptian, we know that Moses had some knowledge of his people and his own identity as a Hebrew, as an Israelite. We're told here in Hebrews 11 that he chose to be mistreated with God's people rather than enjoy the pleasures of the palace. And so at 40 years old, when Moses goes out to his people, he wasn't just taking a look. It seems like he was going out to join them somehow. Acts chapter 7 tells us in verse 24, "And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand." So it's not stated explicitly, but it seems like Moses thinks he's somehow going to save his people. Maybe he even has a sense of God calling him to do this, but as far as we know, God hadn't personally called him yet. Moses doesn't seem to know God when God appears to him as in the burning bush, or as the burning bush. And so I believe that what Hebrews 11 is talking about, or this is what Hebrews 11 is talking about. If he had never gone out to his people to help his people, if he had no desire to help them, he would have just lived as an Egyptian, right? He would have just enjoyed the luxury of the palace and stayed there. But again, Hebrews 11 tells us, by faith, let me read it again. "By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. So here's where this passage gets confusing. In verse 26, it says, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. I always suggest if we don't understand something, we look at a different translation. So the NLT says on the bottom there, he thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. Did Moses know about the coming Messiah? And if he did, how much did he know? We don't know the extent of what he knew, but we know that he did know about the Messiah. In John chapter 5, Jesus is speaking to a group of Jewish leaders, and he says in verse 46, for if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? So Moses did know something about the Messiah. There are clear references to the Messiah in Genesis 3 and Numbers 24 and in Deuteronomy 18. And I believe that what Jesus is saying here is that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, right? That's what Jewish tradition tells us as well. But there are clear references in Deuteronomy 18. God is telling Moses to tell the people, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. This is clearly a reference to Jesus. There were other prophets, but Moses was the most significant prophet in the history of Israel. That is until Jesus came. And so Moses did know something about the Messiah. But I don't think that's what Hebrews 11:26 is telling us. When it says, he thought it better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. When we see the theme of this chapter, chapter 11 in Hebrews, the theme is faith. And so this verse is telling us that faith chooses God and what he offers over the temporary pleasures of sin. Again, Moses could have stayed in the palace. He could have stayed there and lived out the rest of his life, indulging in the pleasures of the palace. Instead, he understood that what God had to offer was far more valuable, even if God calls him to suffering, which he did. Moses follows God and he suffers for it, mostly at the hands of his people. But Moses probably didn't know that he was suffering for the sake of Christ. He knew that he was suffering for God. God had called him to this. And this verse in Hebrews is making the point that just as Christ suffered for the redemption of God's people, so did Moses. He also suffered for the redemption of God's people. One commentator I read says, anyone who suffered because of their faith in God suffers for the sake of Christ. Moses thought it was better to suffer for the redemption of God's people, to suffer for the sake of Christ. There's a comparison being made here. Not in Moses to Christ, but in their suffering. But Moses and Christ suffered, they both suffered to redeem people from slavery. So how does Moses suffer? Well, that's what we're going to look at this morning. Last week we talked about how immediately after the Exodus, the complaining begins. The Israelites find themselves between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army, and they cry out to Moses, why did you bring us here to die? And that complaint is repeated over and over and over for the next 40 years. We can't talk about every instance this morning, so I want to just focus on a few events where Moses suffers as the leader of God's people, of the Israelites, and how he responds to these events. How does Moses persevere? How does he continue in God's call? as the leader of these stubborn and rebellious people. Well, the first event I want to look at happens about 3 months after the Israelites have left Egypt. They've been traveling through the desert. They reach Mount Sinai. And Moses travels up the mountain to get directions from God, and he's gone for a week, and then 2 weeks, and then 3. And the people start to grumble. Where is Moses? Where is our leader? He's been gone for too long. Maybe he's dead. Maybe he's run away. They actually say that in verse 1. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. So after everything Moses had done for them, he's kind of just discarded. As for this Moses, that guy that helped us for a little while, he's gone. It's time to move on. And not only that, the people go to Aaron and they say to him, up, or get up, come on, make us gods who shall go before us. So there's a theory that some scholars have, and it's that the Israelites weren't really asking Aaron to make a new god for them to worship, but a physical representation of God. We can understand the rebellion of the Israelites, but it's just so odd that Aaron would forsake God so easily. He witnessed the miracles that God did. I mean, even his staff changed into a serpent in front of Pharaoh, right? There were many times when God spoke with both him and Moses. Why would Aaron desert God? Also, after Aaron takes the people's gold and makes that golden calf, he builds an altar before the golden calf. And verse 5 says, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. Remember, whenever we see the Lord in capital letters, that's the English translation of Yahweh, God's Hebrew name. So there's some credibility to this theory that they thought the golden calf represented God. But regardless of whether this is the case or not, the Israelites have already been given the 10 Commandments, not written on tablets yet, but spoken by God to them verbally. They heard God speak the 10 Commandments to them. And the second commandment is, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. So even if they did believe that this was a physical representation of God, they were not to make a physical object and worship it. Moses is still up on Mount Sinai when this happens, and God sees what is happening, of course, and he says to Moses in verse 7 of chapter 32, go down, for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. And then Moses pleads with God not to destroy the Israelites. Moses has seen their rebellion. He's experienced it. They were ready to stone him at one point when there wasn't enough water to drink. But we can see Moses' heart here. He has the heart of a true leader. He loves his people. He doesn't want to see them destroyed. And so he pleads with God, and verse 14 says, and the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. I could probably preach a whole other sermon just on this passage here. God tells Moses he's going to destroy the Israelites, and it almost seems like Moses is reasoning with God here in chapter 32. Trying to convince God not to destroy his people, and God relents, we're told. This is a difficult passage because it forces us to ask if God can be reasoned with. There isn't anything he doesn't know, right? How could God be convinced to change his mind? When you read this passage, that's what it sounds like Moses is doing or has done, that he's argued and made a case for why God shouldn't destroy his people, the Israelites, and then God accepts his arguments and relents. Scholars and commentators have explained this by suggesting that God was making what they call a rhetorical demand. That God was basically saying, I'm going to do this unless you intervene. So God is inviting intervention. We see God do this elsewhere. In Amos chapter 7, God tells Amos what he might do to Israel. And so Amos intercedes, and then God relents. In a very familiar story in the book of Jonah, God threatens to destroy the Ninevites in 40 days, and he tells Jonah to go and to give this message to them. But Jonah runs in the opposite direction. He runs away because he knows that, and he tells God this later, he knows that this was actually an invitation from God to the Ninevites to repent. And that's what scholars and commentators believe is happening here in Exodus 32. God isn't being convinced by Moses to change his mind. He's inviting Moses to stand up for the Israelites and to intervene on their behalf. And Moses does do that. In fact, he offers his own life for theirs. He says in verse 32, but now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. But the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But now go and lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. This is a high point in Moses' leadership, a low point for the Israelites, but Moses truly is a shepherd to them. He's willing to offer his own life for theirs. Maybe his 40 years as a shepherd of sheep has helped him in a way to prepare him to shepherd the people of God. He learned to care for the sheep, to protect them, but sheep can be stubborn, and so can the Israelites, right? And God had started providing manna for the Israelites about 10 months or so later, though. They can't stand the stuff anymore. They can't stand manna. And Numbers 11 tells us, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. The cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our strength is dried up and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at. So it's not just the manna that they're tired of. They're also tired of wandering in the desert, and they're wishing that they were back in Egypt. Verse 10, Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, everyone at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly, and Moses was displeased. Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt ill with your servant, and why have you not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive this people? Did I give them birth that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they weep before me and say, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. So Moses is discouraged. He's discouraged, but he doesn't try to just handle that discouragement on his own. He goes to the Lord, right? He goes to the only one who can help him. And God listens to Moses' cry for help, and he calls 70 elders to help bear the burden of leadership over his people. And then God actually provides meat for the people. A strong wind blows in, and with it comes quail, enough for all the people. The next event that I want to focus on is about 2 years after the Exodus. The Israelites finally reached the promised land. God tells Moses to send 12 spies into the land, one from each tribe. And so the spies head out, they do their spying, and when they return, 10 of them don't think it's possible for the Israelites to overcome the people of this land. The people are too strong. They have fortified cities, they say. It doesn't look possible. And long story short, the people listen to the 10 spies and they lose hope. Chapter 14 of Numbers, verse 1 says, "Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night, and all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, 'Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?' And they said to one another, 'Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt.' And Moses and Aaron and the 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who disagree with the 10, they all beg the people to trust that God will give them this land, just as he has promised that he would give them this land. But the people don't listen. And they're just about to actually stone Moses and Aaron and Caleb and Joshua when the glory of the Lord appears and the people back off. The Lord is angry again. Of course he's angry. He's led the people here to fulfill his promise that Abraham's descendants would inherit this land, but they're afraid to enter it. And worse than that, they don't trust the God who's promising this land to them. Incredibly, Moses pleads for the Israelites again. He asks that God would forgive the sin of the people as God has continued to do up until now. And God does forgive them, but they're still punished for their sin. And verse 22 says, "None of the men who have seen my glory," this is God speaking, "none of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers. And none of those who despise me shall see it." And 10 times are mentioned here. 10 times since the Exodus, the Israelites have either complained against God or rebelled against Moses or both. But not trusting God to give them the land that he promised is the last straw. Verse 31, "But your little ones, who you said would become a prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lie in the wilderness." Because Moses is the leader of this people, he will also suffer 40 years in the wilderness. He has to eat the same manna that they eat for 40 years. He has to endure the heat and the weather that they do. Remember, they live in tents. Can you imagine living in tents in the desert in heat like today? On a day like today, we can see why the Israelites were tempted to complain, right? There are 2 more significant events that we know of where the Israelites complain and they're punished for it. Some of the Levites, which were the tribe that were called to be priests, some of the Levites rebel. For the sake of time, I won't get into the details, but God deals with these Levite rebels severely, and they die. And the other event is when Edom does not allow the Israelites to pass through their country, and so the Israelites are forced to go around through the desert. And the people complain again about the long travel, the manna, the lack of water. Numbers 21 says in verse 4, "And the people became impatient on the way, and the people spoke against God and against Moses, Same complaint as always. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? So it's a longing for Egypt again. In the New Testament, Acts 7 tells us our fathers refused to obey him being Moses, refused to obey him, but thrust him aside, and in their hearts they turned to Egypt. So you can see why God does not allow them to enter into the promised land. They've trusted slavery in Egypt over the living God, the God who's proven himself to them over and over and over, who heard their cries in Egypt and actually delivered them, but they've forgotten and they're punished again. Moses, again, he spends 40 years with these people, 40 difficult years leading these people, but he is faithful, he perseveres. Despite their ups and downs, he finishes the task that God has given him, and he dies right before the Israelites enter the promised land. Nearly 40 years after God proclaimed to the children of the rebellious generation, that the children of the rebellious generation would come back and give them the promised land, Moses has led them back to the promised land. So how did he do it? How did he endure the complaining and the threats against his life? How did he endure 40 years wandering in the desert? How does he not give in to discouragement or hopelessness like the Israelites so often do? Well, I think the answer is in Hebrews 11, that passage that we looked at the beginning of the sermon. Let me read it again, verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. How did Moses do it? The answer is by faith. He trusted in God. There are times when he's discouraged. There are times when he complains to God about the rebelliousness of the Israelites. But all throughout, he's put his faith in God. And God carries Moses through the wilderness, through the hardest 40 years of his life. In his last speech to the Israelites before he dies, Moses reminds them in Deuteronomy 1, he says in verse 30, "The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight for you, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes, and in the wilderness where you have seen how the Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son, all the way that you went until you came to this place." So this is true of Moses as well. God carried him as a father carries his son. He was invited to trust God, to place his faith in God, and to follow God. And this is the most important thing that we can learn from the life of Moses. He may not have started out as a great leader, but he was molded by God, and as he put his faith in God, he learned to trust God. His faith grew. It wasn't an immediate thing. His faith and his trust grew as he persevered and as he chose to set his hope in God rather than in the past. The Israelites' hearts were set on the past. Foolishly, they would have rather returned to slavery in Egypt than to trust in God, who had saved them from that slavery. God led the older generation to the border of the promised land, and they actually choose not to go in. He wasn't handing it to them, of course. They were still going to have to do their part, but they refused to trust him. Moses, on the other hand, does trust God. That's the common trait that we've seen in all of these Old Testament heroes that we've been looking at in this series. They leaned on God. They trusted him to accomplish what they couldn't accomplish. And they didn't always start out knowing that at the beginning of their stories, but That's what they learn as they decide to follow God and to do what he calls them to do. That's the one thing that makes these people admirable. It's the thing that makes them stand out. Noah, Abraham, Moses, they didn't just follow God with their mouths. They didn't just say, yes, we will follow. They followed him with their actions. They chose to follow him, whatever that meant, whatever the cost. They were willing to do what he asked. That's something that we actually need to sit down and think about. Are we willing to do what he's asked us to do? And if not, what's holding us back? If we're really honest with ourselves, what is holding us back? Is it fear? Is it laziness? Or is it that we just don't want to? We saw Moses say that to God a few weeks ago at the beginning of his story. He gives God all these excuses for why he can't go. And then after God answers each excuse with a solution, Moses finally says, Lord, send someone else. He initially doesn't want to go. But maybe understanding and recognizing what's holding us back is a good thing, because it means that we can do something about. Whether it's fear or that we just don't want to, we can do something about that. God is the only one that can change our hearts. And so what we can do is we can get down on our knees and we can ask him to do that, right? We can ask him to change our hearts. We see the psalmist do that. In Psalm 51, King David prays, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." And God will change our hearts and our minds, but we have to be faithful to go to him in humility and surrender. Romans 12 says, "I appeal to you, therefore, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." God changes our hearts and our minds, but we have to put ourselves in front of him. We have to be faithful to go to the one who can change us, to reject the ways of the world and to follow God and to do what he asks us to do. Moses is faithful to go to God. We see that throughout these 40 years in the wilderness. When the people are about to attack him, God is his protector. God is his provider. God is the only one who can help, and Moses recognizes that. Moses perseveres. And before he dies, he calls the younger generation who are about to enter the promised land, he calls them to persevere. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." Verse 10, "And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It is the Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve." So Moses calls them not to forget. Their parents forgot, and their parents died in the desert because of it. This is Deuteronomy 6, 24 chapters later. Moses is still talking to them. It's a long speech. He reminds them of everything that has happened. He reminds them of the 10 Commandments, and he gives them new laws to follow in the Promised Land. And then he says to them in Deuteronomy 30, "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him. for he is your life and length of days. So Moses calls the kids of the rebellious people who are about to enter the promised land, he calls them to not forget, to persevere, to choose life. We are also called to the same thing. We're called to choose life and to hold fast to our God and to persevere to the end. In Hebrews 11, we're told about some of the great men and women of the faith. And then in the very next chapter, chapter 12, verse 1 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, all these people of the faith, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted." I don't know what you've faced in your life up to this point. I don't know what you're going to face, but the God who calls us to persevere will help us persevere, not just through the example that Jesus has given us, but he himself will be our strength. Isaiah 40 says in verse 29, "He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might he increases strength. Even youth shall faint and be weary, and young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." God says this to us, and he says to us as well what he said to the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12. God says this to Paul, but this is also for us. God says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Often in our lowest times, we don't feel like God is with us, but he is. What does Moses say to the Israelites after 40 years in the desert? He says, "The Lord your God carried you as a man carries his son." And that is true for us as well. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Let's bow our heads together.